for some people as well, and welcome to today's webinar on probity in practice, moving beyond policy to capability, culture and confidence. My name is Teresa Scott and I am the Executive Director for the Australasian Procurement and Construction Council, and I am today's moderator. Not a great start speaking with the mute on. Let's start with acknowledgement of country. So I recognise that I'm hosting this webinar from the country of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I also recognise the traditional owners of the countries where you are working today and the First Nations people present in today's webinar. I pay my respect to all elders past and present and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and their culture and connections to the land and waters of Australia. To our New Zealand colleagues, tina katu, tina katu, tina kate. In the spirit of connection across the APEC region, we recognise the value and diverse cultures and communities represented here today. So before I introduce the panellists, just a little bit about the webinar and the topic. So today we are talking about probity in practice, and deliberately so. Not probity as a policy sitting on a shelf, not probity as a checklist at the back of a procurement plan, not probity, but probity as capability, culture, and confidence in action. In many public sector environments, probity is still framed in one of two ways. It's either seen as something that slows decisions, it's extra paperwork, extra sign-off, or it's seen as something that only matters when something goes wrong or when there's a complaint or a media inquiry. Both of those framings are risky. They reduce probity to a defensive tool, a compliance shield to protect us after the fact, rather than recognising it as a proactive enabler of sound decision-making. And in the public sector, that distinction matters because we operate in an environment of scrutiny, we manage public money, we shape markets, we influence economic, social and environmental outcomes. When probity is embedded as a capability, when our people understand conflicts, fairness, transparency and confidentiality as part of everyday professional judgment, decisions become stronger, not slower. When probity becomes part of culture, we manage the market, how we document decisions, how we manage information. It builds consistency and confidence across teams. And when leaders model probity, not just in crisis, but in routine decisions, it signals that integrity is not negotiable, even when timelines are tight and pressures are real. Today's session is grounded in that reality. We'll bust a few myths, we'll talk about what probity looks like in practice, and we'll explore how to shift from compliance-driven thinking to confidence-driven leadership. Because ultimately, probity is not about avoiding headlines. It's about earning and sustaining public trust, decision by decision. Well, that's enough from me. I'm delighted to moderate today's webinar and to introduce our esteemed panellists. First up is Lewis Rangot, the Executive Director, Corruption Prevention Division. Lewis started his corruption prevention career at the Commission in 2003. He had held senior corruption prevention roles in the public and private sectors before being appointed to the position of Executive Director, Corruption Prevention in May 2017. Lewis is also a certified fraud examiner. And Senaz Mezabegan is currently the Acting Chief Operating Officer and Interim Chief Performance Officer at Digital Canberra, and is passionate advocate for uplift and procurement and financial literacy across the ACT public service. A commercial lawyer by trade, Sanaz has extensive experience in public sector regulatory frameworks, including procurement, financial governance, and probity, and is an advisor to the ACT Government Procurement Board, a mentor across several mentoring programs in the ACT Public Service, and an active presenter of learning within and outside of the public sector. Sanaz believes in creating communities of knowledge who can confidently innovate to deliver efficient and effective outcomes for the community. I can attest to all of that, as Sanaz is a member of the APCC Council and the Executive Committee, and I have worked with Sanaz for the past 3 years. Now on to Paul Verbuck. He is the Managing Director of AcademyGlobal. Paul has been teaching procurement and contract management in the public and private sector for over a decade. He has trained procurement and project managers across local, state and Commonwealth government agency and teaches at the Australian Graduate School of Management at the University of New South Wales. Paul was previously the Honorary Professor at the University of Technology, Sydney Faculty of Law, and has completed the Harvard Kennedy School Public Leadership Credential, a global public sector qualification in public policy, evidence and leadership. I got through all of that. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. It's not often you get this much experience in one virtual room. It's actually a little bit humbling. I think altogether would be in excess of 30 to 40 years experience and exposure in probity. Just before we do make a start, a reminder that we have 10 minutes at the end for your questions. So please place your questions in the chat and we'll look at those at the end of the session. As we move into the first question, you will see a poll come up on the screen and I encourage everyone to answer that. Okay, so let's make a start. I'll warm up the panelists with a question and I will throw it open. And that question to you is, probity is often seen as something that slows decisions down or only matters when something goes wrong. Why is that framing risky for the public sector? So let me choose. I will go to Lewis, then Sanaz, and then over to Paul, please.
Hi, Teresa. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I suppose the answer to this question, in some ways, that's a normal reaction. You know, the probity person or the probity issues come up when there's a problem. And I think that's partly because when it all goes perfectly and you've got a really experienced sort of procurement team, it all just goes well. And you prepare the documentation, it goes to market, you get your results and you pick a winner. And all while that's happening, you're actually doing probity, but you don't call it probity. You just call it doing your job properly or doing the RFT properly. And so it gets a new label after something goes wrong. You actually are doing probity properly. When it goes well, you just don't call it that. So I think it's almost a labeling problem. It doesn't get called probity until and after there's a mistake. So I think that's part of the answer.
Great, thank you, Lewis. Sanaz, over to you, and I will remind you that you are on mute.
Thank you. Colleagues, hello as well from me. And it's really great to be here and talk probity. Why do people think probity slows us down? I think people think probity slows us down a little bit like what Lewis was saying, because people think probity is something extra on the top of what they should be doing as part of their integrity. They don't see probity as embedded into the fabric of everything that we do as public servants. It's that extra step, it's that extra process. And I was also watching that your map with interest as to whether people were thinking probity is about people, processes, systems. It is, to me, is very much about the people and the people being well-informed, well-educated and having the capability to conduct themselves in a way that doesn't give rise to risk and in a way that engages with risk. That is, as you know, Teresa, another thing that I'm very passionate about. It's not about avoiding your risk. It's not about slowing down. It's about engaging with risk, understanding where the risks are, and then making sure that you deal with those.
Great, thank you, Sinaz. Absolutely, and as risk is part and parcel of procurement, we should pick it up under that element. Thank you. So, Paul, over to yourself.
Thanks, Teresa, and good afternoon to everybody as well. I might zoom out a little bit and talk about consequences associated not only with public sector reputation, individual reputations when probity is not adhered to, but remind us all of the impacts when trust is lost in public sector institutions. For the last 12 or so years that I've been delivering public sector procurement and contracting training, I've liked to reference the Transparency International Fraud and Corruptions Prevention Index. And the Fraud and Corruption Prevention Index is a very interesting, somewhat controversial, but a reliable instrument to sense the pulse of how different countries globally, 190 countries, are seen by diplomats, commercial people, and a range of different people interacting transnationally. And one thing that we observe is that countries which are rated highly on the Transparency International Fraud and Corruptions Index, that is, those for whom there's high levels of confidence in public sector processes, administration, and relative low levels of fraud and corruption, also trend extremely well on the United Nations Human Development Index. So whether we're public servants, whether we're involved deliberately in procurement and contract management roles, or just members of society, we all have an interest in reducing, ideally eradicating fraud and corruption in our public sector systems. So for me, it's a very compelling area that impacts absolutely everybody.
I agree, Paul. In this day and age, trust must underpin government behaviour, and particularly where it relates to government funds. Absolutely, that trust. We will now move on to our next question. We know integrity challenges rarely announce themselves. They emerge in ordinary moments under time pressure and competing priorities. So I'll start with Sinaz and then move to Lewis and then Paul. From your experience, where does probity and corruption risks most commonly emerge in everyday public sector work? Not in theory, but in practice. Sinaz. I think just while Sinaz gets herself organised, Lewis, I'll jump to you and then Paul, and then we'll come back to Sinaz.
Sure, of course. So I suppose looking at the corruption side first, the standard ICAC corruption case is in procurement is like some sort of an insider, usually a person with a financial delegation or some influence. And effectively, like they tilt the playing field to either flick a contract to themselves, their spouse, their business partner, their friend. That's kind of what a pretty standard ICAC corruption job looks like. And maybe they're getting a kickback, or maybe they're getting a cut of the action as well. And maybe they don't actually deliver the goods and services that they've been contracted to perform. So that's your sort of main corruption. That's what almost all of them look like that. But then I suppose more on the probity side of things, and of course, probity, one of the main purposes of good probity is to avoid corruption, but that's just really one of the points. You really just want to obtain a fair process and make sure you pick the best possible supplier. And so if it's not corrupt, it's still sort of tilting the playing field to give some sort of subtle or unsubtle inside run to a particular provider. And so we get plenty of complaints about those. We don't investigate those because they're not corrupt conduct. But all sorts of interesting little ways that one of the potential suppliers gets some sort of a leg up, and obviously we'll unpack that a little bit more as we go through. But some of the ones that we tend to see are allegations around like the incumbent being favoured, or the person that seemed to get more access, or the person that did the lobbying, the agents that did the more lobbying, get some sort of preferential treatment, or some suggestion that there was an inside fix. They somehow had a relationship with an insider that maybe it didn't involve bribery, but someone somehow got the inside run, maybe with some information. So that's kind of what it tends to look like in our complaints profile.
Great, thanks, Lewis. That's really that last point around favouring or a preferential treatment is probably the area that scares a lot of public sector individuals when they're working through their procurement. I'm wondering, Sanaz, if you're back online, you would be the perfect one to respond to that comment and in general what you're seeing in practice.
Thank you. I think I am back online. Hopefully, can you hear me, everyone?
We can indeed. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Apologies, I'm joining from my phone, so it's a little bit challenging. Don't have all the buttons. Where do we see them every day? I think as a probity advisor of some years, I see it, probity and lack of integrity rooted in everyday behaviors. In practice, it is that small tidbit of information that you want to provide a supplier because you're keen to ensure a smoother relationship. It's those situations where you're in a hurry, or you've got government priorities to deliver, and somebody asks you to cut a few corners to make that thing happen faster, including undocumented decisions, I would say. It's developing those relationships that go beyond the professional into other realms. And as human beings, drawing those lines of what is appropriate and when you're crossing those lines are really the very essence of us being human beings. So I do see probity, corruption, not so much. I would say I deal more in the space of probity, where well-meaning people are trying to achieve a particular outcome and they sacrifice certain principles in achieving that outcome.
Right. I'm sure, Sanaz, just on that it's sometimes not deliberate, but an individual has gone down a path and then they've found themselves in a situation where they haven't adhered to probity.
Yeah.
Is that something that you would see in practice as well?
Look, I would say in a good number of the matters that I've looked after, that I've been asked to provide advice, it is not because you get up in the morning and you say, I'm going to do something wrong. It's because you make one tiny decision here and an adjustment, and then as a result of that, then you need to go down that path. It is those times when that small little voice inside your head tells you, I don't know about this, and then there is that real or perceived pressure from outside to be seen to be performing, to be doing the right thing, to move fast, to please other people, to please your boss, to please your political masters. Those are the situations where I think, even though you know better, even though we've got that public sector management, public service framework that tells us what sort of public servants are good public servants, explains that code of conduct to us, it is surprising to me that people still see probity as something outside of what their obligations as public servants are. It still amazes me that people don't see that in the code of conduct. We're talking about conflict of interest there. We're talking about not disclosing information or not benefiting from inappropriate disclosure, and still people look at that as the code of conduct obligations, and then there is probity. I don't really see why we do that distinction. We insist on that distinction, but that's what I see.
Thanks, Sanaz. And for me, I was listening to you in the word courage. We need to have the courage to speak out, and when those pressures are on us, that to step up and say, no, we need to follow the process as best we can to get the outcome we're looking for. Paul, your opinions on this topic?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. Look, I concur with what Lewis and Sanaz have already said, but my couple of small additions might be, I think as leaders, we've got to be extremely conscious that our non-verbal cues, our behaviours are very instructive, particularly to junior staff. So it's not only what we formally say or do in the formal moment, it's often in the informal moment that less experienced staff, younger staff in particular, might be trying to read between the lines. And if there's a conflict between what's said or what appears in a code of conduct or a compliance manual versus actual conduct, even fairly small acts can undermine those more formal areas. The other area, specifically across the procurement life cycle, where I think there can be indications is in the contract management phase. I think very often in the sourcing and procurement phase, we tend to have more highly, and this is a generalization, so no offense to contract managers, but as a rough generalization, we tend to have more formal training at the sourcing and procurement phase in the life cycle. In the contract management phase, we can see areas such as poor performance management of contractor performance, relief for non-performance, being indicative of either probate issues in relation to unfair or unequal treatment, extension decisions around extending contracts, utilizing options where it's really not warranted or merited based upon the performance of the contractor up to that decision point. So there are a couple of quite specific observations across the life cycle.
Right, Paul, I like that you've extended the corruption and probity discussion through to the contract management. And your point about relief and non-performance, wow, that connection there, I think, will be a bit of an eye-opener for a lot of people on today's webinar. Moving on, Lewis, what patterns are you seeing repeatedly in your corruption prevention work, particularly around areas of conflict of interest, gifts, and misuse of information?
So I can probably deal with gifts most easily. I mean, anyone's giving gifts during a tendering process like that, that's just so brazen. It kind of doesn't happen anymore. It's a bit more subtle than that. So often if there's gift giving, it happens while maybe a potential supplier is trying to create a relationship with a potential customer outside. It might happen months or even years before a go-to-market event. And so, of course, on the one hand, government officials are expected to know what's going on in the market. They might want to understand what the latest technology is, but that can breed a little bit of sort of hospitality or face time that other suppliers don't get. But I must say, like giving gifts during a tender process that's kind of pretty close to bribery, and so that's generally well managed. On the misuse of information side, again, if it's just straight out leaking, like you're providing suppliers pricing or that you're leaking the budget, that's obviously corruption. But the more subtle stuff we see is where maybe the budget isn't leaked, but it kind of just gets socialized at various points, maybe during the market sounding phase. And so that's a potential probity breach. Often if you're doing sort of having pre-tender chats, doing research, it can sort of leak out that way. I think in a lot of situations, a government agency will really rely on an external consultant or an external subject matter expert to help them along the way. That might be designing the strategy or even doing the procurement for them. And that external person might not see probity or public sector rules the same way as people like I would. And so they might have slightly looser lips. And I think the other situation that we see, I mentioned before, is incumbents. So you might have an existing supplier delivering any number of different products, and depending on how well locked down you've got your permissions and what's written on whiteboards or what chat is going on in the kitchen, all sorts of weird ways that someone that's already on site in your premises can get access to confidential information. And conflicts of interest side of things, again, I won't go on about incumbency, but there's an issue there. Everyone on the call today would understand this idea of a revolving door. So, often you're across the table from someone that used to be a colleague, or there's someone working on your side. All of a sudden they've quit. They're working for a potential supplier, and there's probably lots of things right with that. You want people to have interesting careers and move around the public and private sectors, but that can be a source of conflict depending on the nature of that former insider's relationship. And the other one, I suppose, that we're seeing a little bit in a few of our jobs is we have, again, I've touched on this lightly, but the suppliers are actually doing the procurement for the agency. So you've got suppliers deciding who the other suppliers are going to be. And And if you say to one of those suppliers, obviously you're acting for the department of ABC, you're acting as though you're a public official, but asking them to disclose their conflicts of interest, it doesn't quite make complete sense. Their interests aren't necessarily the public interest, and so there's a little bit of a departure in their mind about what are my public duties and what are my private interests. It doesn't quite sit as a concept. That person's sitting there to do a task, but they've got these other clients, these other interests, and those types of relationships sometimes get misused. So that's just a brief sketch of some of the things we're seeing.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you. Sanaz, what grey area situations most commonly test staff judgment, especially where policy guidance exists but confidence is low?
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, Teresa. I explain this in this way. I think confidence is typically the lowest, where the right answer depends on factors like perception. Is there perception in this, or is it really wrong? I get that a lot of times as we deliver training. Proportionality, how bad is it? And intent, did you mean it to? So these are things that usually are not in policies. Policies are that sort of principle-based, more high level generally. And as I was saying before, most staff don't breach our policies intentionally. But issues arise when there are ambiguities in everyday situations where rules do exist, but applying them in context is unclear, or there are competing needs or perceptions of competing needs. This is where people our staff, our clients are either second guessing, hesitating before they make a call, and it makes it too late, or they make inconsistent decisions. I have seen that in my career all over the years. I don't think this is a new thing. For example, as I was saying, sharing or what they call socializing information to manage a stakeholder relationship, not disclosing a conflict when you don't think anyone benefits from it. I've heard that as well, where staff think, well, nobody was, or I wasn't benefiting from that conflict or from that disclosure, therefore it's okay. That's sort of third party benefit. Lack of clarity about who owns a decision. And that, as Lois was saying before, this comes up frequently in contract variations. Who's a delegate for that contract, the entirety of the contract? Say we have a $1 million contract, and then who is the financial delegate for making a $20,000 change to it? And there can be ambiguity as to who is responsible for that decision overall. I think our staff are generally tested, and this is because we do run a probity in procurement ACT. We do run a probity function, and people do come to us, but they're usually tested when relationships matter or are sensitive, where information is unevenly distributed or the roles aren't clear, when the time pressures are high, and when our policies require judgment and intersect with those complex human behaviors, like wanting to make friends and wanting to have those what we call, productive relationships appropriately, but could become other types of relationships.
A lot in there, Sanaz. Thank you so much. We're starting to hear some big ticket items around corruption and probity, but also some of those really small ones that can get the public servant into trouble. So, Paul, I might jump to you with when a conflict of interest seems small or harmless, what risks are we overlooking?
Yeah, I think the problem with overlooking what may in substance be a small conflict of interest is that it really sends a terrible signal, particularly to, again, perhaps less experienced or less senior people in the organization who might not be able to calibrate the difference between a minor conflict of interest versus a significant conflict of interest. They may not appreciate that the perception of a conflict of interest can be as problematic as a real or actual conflict of interest. So I think this is a point, again, for leaders and senior staff in particular, is to be highly vigilant on any of those emerging comments or perceptions that might give relief to something which is described as only a small matter or not of particular impact or consequence. It's natural for people's attention to turn to the very significant events and obvious fraud and corruption where there's real or actual conflicts involved. But I think because there's a continuum, it's important to be able to be very clear at the low end of the continuum what risks there are as they develop.
Thanks, Paul. What I'm sensing now is that policy alone isn't enough. And I will start to ask a few questions around the role of capability, confidence, and culture. So, Sinez, back to yourself on what most agencies already have a probity policy. They do. Why do issues still occur, and what does that tell us about the limits of a policy-only approach?
Thank you. And I do like your 3 Cs, the capability, culture, and confidence. And most of our policies can be seen and perceived by our staff as just being about compliance, as that check the box. So that's my 4th C, the C that's not as positive as the others. I think our policies can prescribe rules. Good policies don't prescribe rules. And that's where an organization that does not have very much maturity can struggle. Because most of what I hear when we are delivering basic probity training is just tell me what I need to check off. What is my checklist? What do I need to do to be safe? And yes, there is an extent to which we can tell people what to do, look after your conflicts of interest, declare them early, declare them in writing, make sure you know who's the decision maker. Those are the checks we can do, but we can't eliminate the gray areas, the areas of perception. They are very fact relevant, what you do in terms of your approach. I think staff do understand the policy, but they're not confident applying it. Another point is that policies don't overcome cultural norms or subtle pressure or subtle consistent pressure from wherever it may be. You can imagine. And I think policy compliance breaks down when systems or processes are weak, when we ourselves do not understand why a certain process is in place, or where I should say well-meaning probity officers, probity advisors have created very cumbersome processes around managing probity. I think we see that policies are focusing on rules, but most of our failures, from what I've said, are behavioral. They're not rules-based. So those are my sort of very quick capability, confidence, and culture points. It's not about compliance. It's about using your judgment and being supported to use your judgment, and about engaging with risk, but understanding where that risk ends. It is something that you need to develop as a public servant, as that skill, that muscle.
I really like your comment around policy does not dictate culture. It might guide it, but it doesn't dictate the culture. And again, back to Paul's earlier discussion, really that culture will stem from the leadership and behaving in such a way that is growing the culture that we're looking for, so that probity and is embedded in all of our decision making. Thank you, Sinez. Lewis, I might jump to you with how does fear, uncertainty, or lack of confidence contribute to poor probity decisions, even among those well-intentioned staff?
So yeah, hopefully not too much just fear, but the lack of confidence is interesting. So I think some of our jobs, we've seen situations where the chair of the tender evaluation panel was kind of like the alpha, and that's usually the person. It's their budget. They've done most of the work. They're taking the lead on it, and the other tech members are kind of making up the numbers a little bit. And it's really important that those people, of course, they've that the alpha or the chair might have done most of the work. They might have most of the subject matter knowledge, but the other tech members need to be prepared to disagree, or at the very least ask a whole bunch of dumb questions. And so often there's just too much deference to this chair, and if they're the one as often who's kind of at the highest risk of being conflicted, because they're the ones who've been spending time with the vendors, they're the ones who've got the relationship with the vendors. And so they need to ask all, have complete freedom to ask dumb questions. And we see a lot on IT tenders. If the people on the tech aren't IT experts, I've been in this situation, and you've got to be able to ask, what's this do? What does this mean? I don't understand this. I don't understand why this solution is better than that solution. And there's a lack of confidence in areas like that kind of gets things railroaded into just one person carrying their view carries the day. And it's the same when you have to question a subject matter expert. That person needs to be accountable and answer all of your dumb questions. So that's one, I suppose, example. The other one, I think a lot of evaluation committees don't grapple with, because it's a bit too hard, is often you've got a choice between a gold-plated best of breed product or something that's kind of just fit for purpose. And I sometimes sense that conversation is just not had. And so all of a sudden you're opening bids and one person's offering you belt and braces for $20 million, and someone else is offering you something that'll probably do the job for less than half. And you should have anticipated that way before. That's a conversation that should have happened before you're opening these tenders. So I think the confidence in having that, what are we buying, the gold or the bronze or something in the middle, is an area where people don't necessarily have the confidence to tackle that. I suppose the last one I might just bring up is this thing in my world called insinuation anxiety. It comes from a professor at Cornell University who named Sunita Shah, S-A-H. She's written this quite interesting book recently called Defy. And she says one of the reasons that conflicts of interest don't get properly managed is people don't have the wherewithal to deal with the conflict of interest. They actually do the opposite. So someone might disclose the conflict. They might say, right, I know this counterparty, we're friends, and I'm disclosing my conflict. And normally that's a signal that person, the conflicted person, could be a little bit biased. They could be favoring that person they know. And a reasonable response might be, well, we need to have that person recuse themselves or find an alternative. What kind of happens is the opposite. What tends to happen is that the other tech members or the chair might say, wow, what an honest person that is. They've made their disclosure. Isn't it nice to be working with honest people? I wouldn't dream of insinuating that they're biased or they're going to do the wrong thing. Actually, they're giving me good vibes because they're making these honest disclosures. Let's leave them in on the tech and leave them where they are. It's kind of the opposite, because you're too afraid to insinuate that the person might be a little bit biased. And so you need to have the confidence and the wherewithal to say, thank you so much for telling me. I'm not suggesting that you're about to do the wrong thing, but I think it'd be just best to protect the agency and protect you if we either left you out of this tender or we used you in a different capacity, really throttle back their involvement, as opposed to saying, oh, well, he seems nice, let's let him keep going. So that's a bit of a confidence play there, I think.
And I often say where, conflict of interest is a question asked at the beginning, but it's really just a tick and flick, and we're not really addressing are there conflicts of interest in there. So thank you for that. Moving along, Paul, what changes when staff are trained to recognise risks early rather than react after escalation?
Yeah, there's a few thoughts in relation to that. I think I'd probably go back to a comment that Sanaz made earlier on, that context is everything, and that matters. Certainly is much richer. People can relate to context much more than checklists or internal policy guides. So replicating and creating environments, scenarios, case studies in small groups where you're dealing with an issue that may mirror either a recent problem related to probity, or even potentially imagining that a procurement activity that is yet to be conducted actually suffers probity issues, and then reflecting and unpacking what could have possibly have led to that. Now we call that technique a pre-mortem, sort of builds on the notion of a post-mortem, where you come together and you visualize the types of things that could lead ultimately to problems in relation to this. The point on confidence is really important. It's very hard to be confident, again, when you learn from a manual. It's really about rehearsing difficult conversations, framing questions in a context that actually, is relevant. So they would be the types of things that I would be focusing on. I noticed that Lewis made reference to an academic study from a professor at Cornell. I'd probably also introduce a piece of study called Social Learning Theory by Albert Bandura. And their work is very much focused on the richness of learning ethical conduct through small groups. And if we think about our earliest Australians and the earliest of the New Zealanders, our Indigenous cultures, we can see a lot of these small group meaning making opportunities can be incredibly powerful and influential. And they've served us very well in this country for over 65,000 years. So I think there's a lot that we can learn in traditional ways of building an understanding of values and ethics as well.
Great, Paul. That's a lovely segue into our next section, which is around your education, simulation and rehearsal. And this is so that there are the leaders or the team leaders in the audience can take away some tools and apply in their own teams. So moving on to the role of learning as a corruption prevention tool. Paul, stay on screen. This one is for you. Why is education, particularly scenario-based learning, one of the most effective tools for strengthening probity and integrity?
Yes, no, thanks. And I've probably sort of preempted my own response with some of that preamble there as well. I think it's much deeper when it's socialized. If I'm not sure whether a behavior is appropriate or otherwise, and I'm newer to the organization or perhaps lack confidence, I'm going to be very tuned into how others are responding, particularly senior leadership or those in the organization who have a lot of experience. So we want to create a forum where we can observe each other, we can share our stories on what has gone wrong, be able to talk quite openly. And again, it ties into this social learning theory body of work that just demonstrates it's far more impactful. Getting down into a little bit more detail in terms of how that would come together as a learning intervention, what we try to do is really triangulate several different parts in the equation. So one part is to start with those principles that we can all agree constitute common moral ethical principles. So start with quite a big picture that most people can agree on some fundamental truths. We also then need to necessarily anchor into any of the governance documents which the agency has available. So codes of conduct, any procurement guidance specifically as a subset of that's important, but then also the public interest disclosures piece, I think also needs to be a part of this in terms of what to do to help identify and communicate where there have been breaches. So I don't think we can leave the compliance and the guidance out of the learning intervention, but I think it needs to be brought into a more holistic a set of approaches.
Prevention is the best cure, I think, absolutely. And if you can practice that way, it's fantastic. A little on the ground, Sanaz, simulations and rehearsals, how will they support the teams where e-learning and the policy itself can't?
Look, I'm an old school teacher, so to me, e-learning modules don't really answer the questions that are happening in your own brain as you're going through that product. And they do have a place. They do have a place in telling you what the framework looks like. Do they have a place in letting you become comfortable with that framework? Not really. That's something that we as leaders need to do every day in our workplace. I'll share with you some of the strategies that we've implemented. We've had things called Probity clinics every month where people could come together and share their probity stories, probity questions. And we did have a standing sort of joke about if you have a friend who's done something, come and tell us. Because of course, people feel more comfortable talking about scenarios in theory rather than in practice. You could say, well, I've heard that this is happening. Is that all right or not? We did quite a lot in relation to supplier debriefing, believe it or not, about what can you tell a supplier when they have not been successful? How do you cross that line between giving them enough information to allow them to put in a better bid next time and understand why they weren't successful, to then disclosing other tenderers' information in there. We have talked about how to brief your minister so that your minister has got sufficient information, but is not providing having undue influence in relation to your procurement. So that sort of storytelling and expanding on the scenarios is the thing that really is the stuff of people feeling more comfortable with this space of probity. We should appreciate, I do appreciate, sometimes forget, but I do appreciate that not everybody out there is eating and drinking probity in the same way as some of us are. And therefore, probity can be a scary word for people. Probity can be the fear of punishment, the fear of losing your job, the way that some of us would, and its intersection with integrity necessarily makes it scary. So how do you make that not as foreign and scary? And the way to do it is through teaching and showing people the different scenarios and how you can work through those scenarios so they're not worrisome.
Yes, I love that the ability to talk about it openly, the storytelling, but it's in a safe environment. It doesn't become scary. Let's test the thinking before we have to go away and really practice that or put it into action. I love that, Sanaz. I am watching the time, and I will remind the audience to please put any questions into the chat where we are about to get to the audience question time. Last question up, Lewis. How does practicing responses to gifts, conflicts, or undue influence change real world behaviour? So how does the practicing work?
Yeah, I think I can probably be brief. My answer is just a slight tweak on what Sanaz just said. So I think the answer to this is when you're practicing in almost like a classroom situation, it's not real. You're in a nice, cold, calm state. But when you're in a real life scenario where there's an actual probity drama, an actual conflict of interest, or someone said, there's a media inquiry, you're in a hot state. And so if you can practice in a cold state, it helps you deal with it when the emotions are flying everywhere and you're under this pressure. And that's when most people, not everyone, but most people, their judgment loses them when we're under that kind of pressure. So it's a little bit like practicing a sport. It's like practicing chess or something. If you practice when the stakes aren't high, and when the stakes really are high, it's just like going to the gym or playing chess or anything like that. So practicing in a cold state helps you deal with it when you're in a hot state, and that's kind of the point.
Yeah, that was part of your DNA. Yeah. Okay, we have a few questions popping up, but for the three panelists, what's one capability you wish every public official had before they face their first high-risk probity moment? Lewis, you're still on screen, so I'll let you answer first.
Oh, that's a shame. I was hoping to go last. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
That's okay. No.
We'll go to Sanaz, is still up there on screen.
No,
Sanaz,
it's
Paul,
okay.
and then Lewis.
Sure. I think if one thing would be that to know they would know before they would come. What's the one skill? I think asking questions and being curious. Don't closing things off. Don't sort of saying, oh, well, that person has disclosed a conflict of interest, therefore it must be good. Just asking, so what does that do? Where do we go next? If I could get our public servants, our colleagues to see how would that scenario play out in 3 further steps, slowing down a little bit. I think a lot of times when we get asked to provide probity advice, it's in an urgent and hot environment, as Lois was saying. That hot environment is not always as hot as we think it is. So how can you sort of say, is it really hot, or are you just worried about what might happen? Or are you just worried that you didn't think about that? The other thing I would like, although I think everybody's aware of it, is just that we're not quite sure what to do with it, is perception. I think that's the thing that raises for us a lot of complexity, and not even complexity, but complicated scenarios.
Thank you, Sanaz. And Paul, just a quick summary there from you.
Yeah, look, I think in terms of competencies, and I agree with your comment, Teresa, prevention's better than cure, but I do think we need to have higher levels of confidence in how to interact with the public interest disclosures. I think there's still a big hangover from perhaps some poor performance around the previous whistleblower legislations. I don't think there's a general mood that whistleblowers do well. I think we need to be a lot better at that. The other thing, I think we need to help people to be encouraged to have more robust, respectful, but robust conversations with peers and even senior managers when they're observing things that don't make sense in terms of what they know and understand what constitutes probity.
Great. Thanks, Paul. I've come up with a further 3 after listening to the fabulous panelists: courage, curiosity, and being conscious of probity and corruption. So they're my 3 from your takeaway. We do have a few questions. I'm not sure if the panelists can actually see those questions, and I'm happy for any of the panelists to answer. How can professionals keep in mind probity standards and integrity while seeking to negotiate to win the best deal or outcome for their department? So 30 seconds.
Teresa, could I answer that? I think it comes from one of the earlier points I was making, that we think winning and probity are mutually exclusive. I think how you can keep in mind probity standards and integrity, you weave that into your process. If you're negotiating to win the best deal, you can still make your stakeholder, and I call it stakeholder because it could be your minister, it could be your supervisor, it could be the tenderer, it could be the members of the public. You can still be transparent with them and explain your own limits and your own possibilities. And I think quite often as public servants, we're seeing that sort of withholding information without understanding when to release it and how to release it are the key things. It's not about withholding. It's about knowing how to explain that to someone so they come on the journey with you and understand where you're coming from.
Thank you, Sanaz. I'll just pause before we go to the next question, but did Lewis or Paul want to jump in and add to what Sanaz just said? Happy for me to go to the next question.
I've probably got a quick view. I think it's a great question, by the way. I think the first is that we have to define winning as not necessarily being that we have equivalent goals. So winning in public sector professional behaviour is about doing the right thing and following probity and adhering to that very, very closely. In terms of expected behaviours, I think we also need to understand that it is in fact an unlevel playing field, and there's not a lot that we can really do about it. Many private sector firms will use tactics and all sorts of marginal behaviours, and that will be seen as just being part of the way in which you play a tough commercial game. But we can't do that, of course, on the public sector side. So I think it's about clarity of roles and responsibilities and defining winning perhaps slightly differently.
Just pausing for Lewis. Any thoughts, or happy for me to move on?
No, I think Paul and Sanaz have captured it beautifully.
Yeah, there's a really interesting question here around cautionary tale for things that have gone wrong, and it can also create fear of people speaking up when they have concerns. And any tips on how to promote a culture of reporting in this context? Really, Lewis, I might start with you if that's okay on that one.
So the received wisdom on this is you need to be able to let people choose the reporting channel that they are most confident in. So that means having multiple channels. It might be their boss, it might be an external hotline or something like that. They need to be able to stay anonymous if they choose. But the thing that deters a lot of complainants or whistleblowers is it just goes into the ether and nothing happens. And so even if it turns out that you look into it and their allegations aren't sustained, you need to get them back get back to them and tell them what happened. I looked into this and we satisfied ourselves it wasn't a conflict, for instance. You've got to close the loop with them. But I suppose in a more sober way, whistleblowers still, despite our legislation being in pretty good shape at the moment, it does take a degree of bravery. There are not many great whistleblower stories that we can report on, at least the public ones anyway. The ones that are all sort of held in private, they are the more successful ones.
Great. Okay. Any comments on that one from you, Sanaz?
I would say yes, thank you. Just to add to that, small R reporting. I think we talk about big R reporting, which is, our disclosure obligations and so forth. But having someone to talk to, having a role in your organization that people can go to, and we have different titles for this role, be it your probity advisor, be it your SERBER, your senior executive responsible for integrity, or other roles. Somebody that you can go to who's not otherwise invested in that project is a very great way to do that. The other thing is not having a culture of punishment. I think that fear, we talk about fear, is the thing that people are worried about. What if I'm asking the wrong question? What if this is bad for my career? What if this will result in me not having my further promotion, or people feeling that I can't really engage with risk? Ask the question, see what happens, and always focus on the solution and the pathway forward. It is rare that in probity we will not have any pathway forward as a result of somebody disclosing something. And that's kind of about that outcome and winning. You can still get the outcome. It might just not be in the path that you were embarking on.
Thank you, Sanaz. We do have a question around the situation in Victoria and the big build. We could be here for another 2 hours answering that one. So we might have to take that one offline and see if the panelists will provide a response to that via the email. We will in a moment talk about some training. So I might just round it up with 3 minutes to go and ask the panelists one last question. If agencies could do one thing better tomorrow to strengthen probity in practice, what should it be? Paul, I'll start with you, then Sanaz, and then finish with Lewis.
I think the first for me would be really create opportunities for people to come together in small groups to talk about the realities, challenges that they've seen, risks that they anticipate that relate to probity, including upcoming projects. To try to find the time and make it a very deliberate step. It will achieve so much more than just the content. It will demonstrate leadership placing a value on what's derived from those conversations, and people will feel listened to and they'll feel respected, and you'll open up channels for them to contribute in less formal ways in other circumstances.
Thank you, Phil. Sorry, Paul. Sanaz.
I'm also very much for that probity check-in, that more informal capability uplift, where people can come and ask about ambiguous matters, about things that are bothering them, keeping them up at night. I think empowering people to stop, reflect, and get guidance without being afraid. That does more for probity than any policy, tool, or training program could do. So stop, reflect, seek advice. Don't be afraid.
Thank you, Sanaz. And Lewis.
I think maybe just touching on those 2 points, often the person who's raising the probity issues has no positional power. They're not the project manager. They're potentially a relatively minor player. So what Paul and Sanaz just said is great, but how do they cut through to someone who can actually make a difference? So in some ways, it's the question is, what can we do tomorrow? Well, we need to wait for those relatively unempowered people to get skip a few steps potentially and get right up to the project sponsor or the project sponsor's director or something like that. Because if it just gets stuck in the echo chamber, they'll say, well, I'm concerned about X, and someone just says, well, noted, thank you, nothing happens. So that's an obstacle.
Great, thank you. Thank you. We are running out of time. A quick summary is probity and corruption, we need to look at it across all phases, including when we go to the market, when we're assessing bids, and when we're managing the contract. They can be from small, unintended, but have big consequences to large, deliberate corruption and everything in between, including when we brief our ministers. It is all about the leadership and the culture. It is underpinned by training and in-house education awareness programs as well. I think at the end of the day, we need to embed it. It needs to be part of the DNA. It's not a bolt-on. And my final comment is that procurement is that gateway between how the government funds are being used. And if procurement doesn't do it well, we erode the trust in government. So it is absolutely important for procurement to think about probity in all of our decisions. Now, I know that we have into the training, we have to augment everything that you heard today through an education pathway. AcademyGlobal has designed for public sector professionals this intensive hands-on masterclass. It's designed to strengthen your confidence, judgment, and decision-making in real-world probity and integrity solutions. So if you want to go a little bit further and do some hands-on training, we highly recommend this course, which masterclass, which has been certified by the APCC to meet the national standard. Then finally, thank you to our esteemed panelists. It's been a great conversation. This session has been recorded and will be put up onto the APCC education page on our website. Look, lots of hands, lots of thank you very much to our panelists. And that's it for us today. Thank you all for joining us. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.